everyone. Thanks so much, Alina, for that, as always. So pleased that you could join us today. Another beautiful day in Santa Barbara. I don't know where you all are, but I hope that you're not suffering from the catastrophic weather that we've been experiencing in the States today. It's been a kind of a red letter day for many of us, and hopefully that will make this lecture somewhat even more relevant. I thought it was a timely topic when we decided to ask Justin Wolff to come and do this talk on dread and 1930s American art, but now it seems even more appropriate. So let me just tell you a little bit about Justin Wolff. He's a professor of art history at the University of Maine, and most of his work focuses on 19th and 20th century American art and visual culture. He's published two major books on Richard Keaton Woodville and on Thomas Hart Benton, both of whom are now considered canonical artists, and both of those books classic now in the scholarship. And more recently, he's done an exhibition and a book on Rufus Porter, a 19th century artist and inventor, and that was on view at the University Art Museum there at Bowdoin in December of 2019 and through May 2020. He's also contributed essays to anthologies and journals, including A Strange Familiarity, Alexander Forbes, and the Aesthetics of Amateur Film, and that's going to be published. And he is now working and living still in Maine. So with that, I hope you'll enjoy his lecture. I know you will. And let's welcome to our virtual stage. And thank you so much for joining us. Take it away, Justin.
Thank you very much, Ike. And thank you to the Santa Barbara Museum of Art for inviting me to share some of my more recent research with you today. I'm delighted to be here. And I'm going to just allow me to start my screen share, get my PowerPoint up. Okay, so the title of my talk today is Ashes to Dust, American Art and the Dreadful 30s. Let me begin with a general proposition, lifted directly from the great cultural theorist Raymond Williams. It is about what Williams called structures of feeling. And to put it very basically, Williams claimed that we feel things before we think them. And it is in our attempt to make sense of the things that we feel that we begin to think. It is, he writes, that we are concerned with meanings and values as they are actively lived and felt. Now, Williams developed this idea as he tried to explain the emergence of period styles, in particular in literature and art. He was thinking about how groups of people from different places and from different eras develop unique styles and attitudes. Now, I begin here because my broadest claim today is that images allow us to live feelings and notice their formal qualities before we even begin to think about those feelings logically and systematically. Images pull groups of people, not just individuals, into certain feelings before these groups have thought about those feelings. In short, images are effective. Now, this is especially true when groups of images work together to affect a feeling or mood, and even more true still when we see diverse kinds of images, or a democracy of images, if you will, structure feelings. Now, today we will see how prints and paintings coming from the world of fine art collaborated with other sorts of images produced by amateur photographers, documentary photographers, photojournalists, and even scientists and astronomers to affect a particular feeling. Now, my more specific claim today is that in the United States in the 1930s, and especially in 1936 and 1937, many images coalesced in the public arena to affect a feeling of profound cosmic dread. This dreadful feeling stirred social and political action. And this matters because today, of course, we face challenges as dire as those of the 1930s. In the United States in the 1930s, there was an economic depression, an agricultural disaster, and the beginnings of a total war and the rise of fascism. Today, there is a pandemic, ecological crises, racial violence, and still, of course, war. I recently started a new research project on the subject of American art and catastrophe. And now seems like a good time for such an inquiry. I figure that if I'm already completely bummed out and anxious about the world, I might as well start a book about America's dreadful feelings and offload some of that dread to anyone who is willing to listen. Thank you for being here today, I should add. I have begun the project by looking at the 1930s, which is my topic today. But before I get there, let me offer a brief tour through some artworks, mostly by American artists, but not all, that, as Raymond Williams might put it, have structured feelings and continue to structure feelings of catastrophe, disaster, and dread. So Rashid Johnson's anxious red painting, December 18th, feels about right to me anyway. The painting is one of many of his featured in an online exhibition that he's made since the onset of the global coronavirus pandemic. Using oil stick on cotton rag paper, he shows a recurring character whom he calls Anxious Man. The crude archetypal faces express the fundamental tensions and traumas that course through our lives today. The painting is a potent visualization of the absurdity and the pain of anxiety. Crises require action. But what if we are trapped? Even before the pandemic, the art world was affecting dreadful feelings aplenty, as evidenced by these two major exhibitions, Catastrophe and the Power of Art at the Mori Art Museum in Tokyo, 2018 to 19. And you see here the cover of the exhibition catalog. And then on the right, Damage Control, Art and Destruction Since 1950, which opened at the Hirshhorn Museum in DC and then traveled internationally. This work was featured in the Catastrophe and the Power of Art exhibition in Japan. Thomas Hirshhorn is a Swiss artist who specializes in large installation pieces, lately with a focus on rubble and ruin. Ruins, says Hirshhorn, always mean something. A ruin stands for a structural, an economical, a cultural, a political, or a human failure. And he aims to give form to destruction and the destructive impulse in these large installations. Vilja Selmon's paintings and drawings of disasters were featured in the Damage Control exhibition in Washington. Works like Bikini feature a deadpan delivery of catastrophic information with both an austere intensity and an impassive matter of factness. Especially interesting to me is how the drawing, the graphite drawing, references the media. Now, one might presume that this, and the reference is made, you can see that the graphite drawing has this trompe l'oeil effect where it appears, of course, that there's a bit of paper torn from the news. So one might presume that this minimizes the impact of the drawing, signaling atomic apocalypse as just another everyday news item. But I would say just the opposite, and nothing more complicated than this, that the drawing visualizes the role of media imagery in distributing disaster to our consciousness. And just quickly, so I don't get too far afield, I would say that America was built on catastrophe and disaster, both social and natural. We live in a nation formed from epic violence between colonists, other European nations, and indigenous populations. We see the massacre, a drawing, an engraving, pardon me, of the massacre at Jamestown on the left, and this fascinating engraving showing the destruction of a Pequot fort in present-day Connecticut by British forces. published in 1638. And though Americans defined the new nation in relation to the continent's natural splendor and wild spaces, artists like Thomas Cole understood that nature was violent and unpredictable, that it could be humiliating. Natural disaster became for him and others a metaphor, an emotional equivalent for political and social catastrophe, most evident in his famous Course of Empire paintings. And Destruction of Empire is the fourth in a series of five that shows the rise and fall of a allegorical nation, but obviously referencing the United States. The contemporary artist Alexis Rockman knows this and has mapped Cole's apocalyptic imagination onto the current zeitgeist, specifically the widespread consensus that we are currently in the midst of a climate catastrophe. In Manifest Destiny, he shows the Brooklyn Bridge in New York in ruins, aglow with eerie light and reclaimed by prehistoric creatures, such as jellyfish and reptiles. You can spend a lot of time trying to find the various kinds of references in these large-scale paintings by Rockman. During the last third of the 19th century, American artists capitalized on a taste for disaster, especially shipwrecks, which were remarkably common and in fact still are to this day. Anyone with a passing knowledge of Winslow Homer knows, of course, that disaster on the sea, whether shipwrecks or other kinds of existential crises, became his trademark. Rockman and Hirshhorn are savvy students of art history and have made references in their work to William Bradford and, for instance, to works like Géricault's iconic raft of the Medusa. In the Gladstone Gallery exhibition, Concordia, Concordia, Hirshhorn installed a large-scale mess inspired by the sinking of the cruise ship Costa Concordia, which ran aground off the coast of Italy in January 2012. That disaster played out across the media. And Rockman has a whole series of shipwreck paintings that dramatize the history of human hubris on the sea. And finally, here are two artists who branded their art as disaster art. Andy Warhol's Orange Car Crash was just one of his many death and disaster works that featured car crashes and, of course, the death penalty, especially images of the electric chair. And Donald Sultan's Yellowstone, August 15th, 1990, is one of his so-called disaster paintings, which shows a Western wildfire, unfortunately, like the ones burning as I speak. Okay. These are the kinds of images that I'll be looking at over the coming years as I move it forward on this project. But now let me get to today's more focused topic. The concurrence of the Depression and the Dust Bowl was the most deeply felt disaster in the United States since the Civil War. The Dust Bowl, a devastating agricultural and social catastrophe, appeared just a few years into the economic collapse. In an authoritative account of the Dust Bowl, the historian Donald Worcester describes the collapse of the Great Plains as a total failure and evidence of the ecological insensitivity of our culture. Our failure to adapt to the rigors of the plains rendered them, he said, our cultural boneyard, where the evidence of bad judgment and misplaced schemes lie strewn about like bleached skulls. He maintains that the Dust Bowl ranks as the third biggest environmental blunder in history, behind the deforestation of China's uplands around 3000 BC and the destruction of Mediterranean vegetation by livestock. But in contrast to those disasters, the Dust Bowl took only about 50 years to accomplish. Once settlers blazed onto the plains, they began busting and breaking them very rapidly. The artist Alexander Hogue captured the trauma of the Dust Bowl in a signature style. His stark prints and paintings combined regionalist realism with a modernist sensibility and are appropriately blunt and unfussy. As Hogue shows it, the technological instruments of what Worcester calls the Great Plow-Up are just as desiccated as dead plains cattle. What I find most interesting, though, is that Hogue's paintings were featured in a Life magazine article from June 21st, 1937. Here I am showing you the spread from that article, just as it appeared, which featured 2 paintings reproduced in full color, and then on the right side of that spread, a very brief article on Hogue. The article concludes with this sobering sentence. By placing symbols together in neat geometric patterns, Hogue hopes to produce a super realism that will make the observer not only see the Dust Bowl, but also feel its heat, its despair, its anguished death, and the tragedy of its farmers. In this issue of Life, we see what I described earlier as a democracy of images, right? The 2-page spread was immediately followed by the 2-page spread immediately following the one showing Hogue's paintings, featured these terrifying photographs taken by a cameraman for the March of Time film series, which was popular in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. March of Time series is when they would show news items, newsreels before films. And the caption describes a black fog moving at 40 miles per hour, pouncing on a cowering film crew. And the end of this caption reads, "Nothing can live here." And so here again, to reiterate, is my main point. During the Depression and Dust Bowl, the distinctions between fine art, documentary photography, and journalism collapsed as each genre was called upon to express an apocalyptic mood, a sense of doom and dread. In fact, the dread of the dreadful 30s was a feeling structured by all kinds of images reproduced in popular newspapers and magazines. It was a diversity of imagery that resulted ultimately in federal intervention, which is a lesson we would do well to remember today as we face our current crises. Now, let me demonstrate this point with another example. First, I'm just going to show you some images of the Dust Bowl that appeared in the popular press during the 1930s. And these are infinite, these images that I have found. And I'm just going to show you briefly, without much commentary, several. America's Land was published by the Resettlement Administration, a New Deal program. And you can see just the headlines and the photograph here. And then on the right, Enemies of the Earth from the Dayton Daily News. Fight on the Dust Demon, Indianapolis Times. And one of the things that I really enjoyed finding were the photographs, the illustrated articles on meteorology in the monthly weather review, which is really an academic journal, but with really high quality and rich imagery. Now, you likely recognize the photograph shown here in the Saturday Evening Post and the New York Times. This is Arthur Rothstein's iconic photograph titled "Farmer and Sons Walking in the Face of a Dust Storm." It was taken in April 1936 in Cimarron County, Oklahoma. Rothstein was not a newspaper photojournalist, but rather a highly trained government employee working on behalf of Roosevelt's New Deal, specifically the Farm Security Administration. The main objective of this endeavor was to structure a feeling of dread, the only relief from which was to advocate for government intervention in economic and agricultural affairs. Rothstein was born in New York in 1915 and graduated from Columbia University in the spring of 1935. Columbia was the nerve center of Roosevelt's brain trust, and the progressive economics professor Rexford Tugwell was appointed director of the Resettlement Administration in April of 1935. Tugwell then asked a Columbia colleague, Roy Stryker, to run the agency's historical section, and in turn, Stryker invited Rothstein, a former Columbia pupil, to join the stable of photographers who would document rural poverty and agricultural blight throughout the US. Rothstein signed on that summer, right after graduating. At 21, he was the youngest of the group. Rothstein's first assignment was to build a darkroom in Washington, D.C., so that Stryker could be as close as possible to the negatives that Walker Evans, Dorothea Lange, and others were sending back from the field. Stryker grew to admire Rothstein's technical skill and loyalty and soon sent him to the field as well. And less than a year later, when he was just 22, Rothstein went on a 5-month assignment, photographing the drought-stricken plains in Texas, Oklahoma, South Dakota. Between March and April 1936, he took several photographs that stand out as icons of the FSA project. Stryker wrote to Rothstein in the field, quote, "We will now probably have the finest collection of drought pictures in the United States when you finish this trip." Cimarron's widely respected county agent, William Baker, admitted that his county had been more severely and widely affected by wind erosion than any other county on the southern plains. If there was an archetypical Dust Bowl community, eroded, depopulated, broke, and on relief, it was Cimarron. Between 1930 and 1940, Cimarron County lost 40% of its population. In the 1920s, annual reproduction per acre was 13.1 bushels. In the 30s, it was 0.9 bushels per acre. And of the 250,000 acres planted in 1936 in Cimarron County, not a single head of wheat matured in 1937. Rothstein's Farmer and Sons shows people that we know. This is Arthur Coble and his sons, Milton and Darrell Coble, in the Oklahoma Panhandle during a fierce blow-up or a fierce dust storm. In an interview, Rothstein recalls seeing barns and sheds almost buried by drifts and dust so thick that he could hardly breathe. The land and the sky seemed to merge and there was no horizon, he said. Rothstein also explained that the dust ruined his expensive camera as well as his right eye, which required surgery later and turned him ever after into a left-eyed photographer. But it is not Rothstein's suffering that mattered at this time. The photograph worked together with a raft of other popular images to structure the nation's feeling about this disaster. And how did the photograph do this? How did it affect such dread? In part, of course, because of its aesthetics. A father and his 2 boys scurrying through stinging dirt, heads down to a shabby, forlorn outbuilding. The visual power comes from the stark analogy drawn between the imperiled figures and the entombed fence posts, which read as burial markers. The doom is intensified by the desperate building, once patched up, but now left on its own, and the wind blowing against the very fabric of the figure's existence. And then the straggling boy falling behind as the final symbol of total catastrophe. It was a picture that had a very simple kind of composition, Rothstein later said, but there was something about the swirling dust in the shed behind the farmer. What it did was, that again, this is Rothstein, what it did was it showed an individual in relation to his environment. You know the old axiom that art is the expression of man. So here, if this picture has any art, it's because it's an expression of man, close quote. What Rothstein meant, I think, is that the photograph superbly structures a feeling of dread. And one felt not just by Oklahomans, but by citizens throughout the country in 1936 and 1937. And it was a dread that was quite literal. In an interview many years later, Darrell Coble, the little boy straggling behind his father and brother, recalled that day. Quote, yeah, it scared me. I thought the world was coming to an end. I just didn't know. Another survivor of the Black Blizzard that day recalled the vicious storm. Quote, we see the cloud coming in, just black, black dirt. And I'll never forget my grandmother. She said, you kids go and run and get together. The end of the world is coming. As Timothy Egan puts it in his history of the disaster, titled The Worst Hard Time, quote, it seemed on many days as if a curtain were being drawn across a vast stage at world's end. Rothstein's photograph, by the way, is the frontispiece to Egan's a prize-winning book on the Dust Bowl. Now, such was the magnitude of dread that even the stalwartly conservative Boise City News, the major newspaper in Cimarron County, stated on its front page, quote, "With all this talk of rugged individualism, of unwarranted government interference in economic matters, we are reminded again by bitter Black headlines that there are some problems that must be solved by a socially conscious federal government, or they will not be solved at all. And among these are problems upon the solution of which the very future of American civilization depends." The locution, "the end of the world," was so common in personal and media accounts of the Dust Bowl that it seeped into the national discourse. It wasn't only the dust from the Great Plains then that blew east to darken the skies of New York City. It was in fact a zeitgeist. And I do want to point out that indeed New York City skies were blackened by dust storms. And this wonderful photograph of the Texas Panhandle by Rothstein is reproduced down here in the lower left of this New York Times article titled "A Challenge to Save the Basis of Our Life." My point is that the aura of dread would not have been deeply felt throughout the nation had these photographs not been circulated publicly, so they could work with a host of other images to structure something deeply felt. And it wasn't just images of the Dust Bowl or even the Depression that Rothstein's photographs mingled with. There were, of course, images of fascism and European war. Photos of Dust Bowl masks could be seen in the same publications that forewarned of chemical and gas warfare as Hitler, Mussolini, and Franco came to power. Dust Bowl images then were mapped onto images that structured feelings about the coming war, about fascism, and as far-fetched as it may seem, about the actual, literal end of the world. On November 1st, 1937, the same year as the Life magazine article about Hogue, and the same year as the appearance of Rothstein's photograph in the popular press, 4 lithographs by the American artist Rockwell Kent were featured in another Life magazine article titled "Hayden Planetarium Shows 4 Ways in Which the World May End." New York City's Hayden Planetarium, part of the American Museum of Natural History, opened in 1935, and thanks to its Zeiss 2, which was the preeminent cinematic projector of the day, its Theater of the Stars program was an instant sensation. And its most popular program by far was Dr. Clyde Fisher's lecture on end of the world scenarios. Against a backdrop of projected images depicting colliding planets, Fisher described, quote, "some of the possible ways in which Mother Earth may meet her doom." One advertisement for the show struck a sensationally apocalyptic tone. Quote, within the next 10,000 years, a comet may strike us, or still worse, a fiery star comes sliding by in the night. The sun may either heat up or burn out. Even the moon is likely to become a villain in this celestial tragedy. Come and see for yourself, the program reads. Now, by 1937, Rockwell Kent was a celebrated writer, printmaker, and painter, best known for depictions of the desolate landscapes where he spent much of his time: Monhegan Island in Maine, Alaska, Tierra del Fuego, and Greenland. But it was his talent for book illustration. He had already produced prints for such classics as Beowulf, Candide, and Moby Dick that made him the perfect candidate for the Life magazine commission. He had an impeccable design sensibility, and the editors surely believed that his spare but haunting style would lend considerable graphic punch to the sensational article. At the very least, they trusted that Kent could produce prints with more gravitas than the humdrum illustrations featured in the Hayden's Planetarium show, 2 of which you see here. So these images were actually projected in the planetarium to illustrate these end of the world scenarios. And the editors of Life rejected these images and turned to Kent, if I didn't make that clear. So Kent did not disappoint. Compare, for instance, his depiction of lunar disintegration to the Hayden's drawing of the same subject. Whereas the drawing shows the event as a background incident occurring in the sky above distant mountains, Kent brings the encounter down to earth, rendering the impact as a collision of elemental spherical forms occurring in proximate space. Kent transforms a merely theoretical encounter into a visual experience that arouses deep, sublime feeling. Hayden Planetarium scientists published several articles to promote its Theater of the Stars program. And in October 1937, for instance, the Hayden's own monthly bulletin, The Sky Magazine of Cosmic News, featured a cover article declaring, quote, the end of the world. And you can see that they used that drawing that I had just shown. And then 1 month later, Life magazine's article appeared. Now, in simple terms, Hayden scientists claimed that disruptions to Earth's orbital speed and gravity could destroy the sun and or the moon, either scenario meaning the destruction of our planet. As stated in the Life article, planetary collisions or the breakup of the moon might cause the sudden incineration of all life on Earth. When the end of the world does arrive, it states, and incandescent globes the size of the Empire State Building will start pelting the Earth, and human beings will suffer a cataclysm. That's an understatement, I would say. The science behind these theories was obviously complex and drawn from many sources. But to the rapt audiences of his planetarium lectures, Dr. Fisher focused on just 4 of the ways by which, quote, celestial perturbations may bring to us slow or sudden death. I love that distinction, or that lack of distinction. The death will be slow or sudden. In the first scenario, which Kent illustrates in lunar disintegration, an accumulation of mass caused by asteroid and comet debris would cause the Earth's rotation to slow, thus disrupting the Moon-Earth equilibrium. Consequently, the moon would fall into the Earth. And in this event, quote, the pull on the near face of the moon will be far greater than that on the far side. The difference between the two forces will shatter the moon before it reaches us. Yet at the same time, attraction of the moon on the surface of the Earth will open up belching volcanoes. And you can see just that taking place in the foreground. And he shows these volcanoes bubbling up as the moon makes impact. Pardon me, jumped over an image. The Hayden scientists claimed to know one thing for sure, and that was that the sun was dying. When it does, they claimed, immense blankets of ice will creep over the continents. Men and women will live in subterranean habitations and then starve to death. The solar fade out depicts this second scenario. The figures who resemble the indigenous people Kent portrayed in drawings, prints, and paintings during expeditions in Alaska and Greenland are dressed in parkas, and they cluster in the foreground on a ridge above a modern city and await, quote, the final freeze. The third scenario, Fisher explained, would come about if our sun suddenly brightens into a flaring nova. Such an explosion on the part of the sun will come unexpectedly and last a few hours or maybe a few days. This flare-up, Fisher explained, will scorch all vegetation and make the oceans boil. Rather than show the sudden explosion of the sun that Fisher describes, Kent elected to illustrate something far more terrible, radiating flashes from a flaring sun slowly searing the earth into a desert and boiling flesh to bone. And you can see down here under the dead tree, human skeletal remains. The fourth apocalyptic scenario would be caused by degravitation. In any moment, Fisher claims, some cold celestial body may shoot earthward out of another corner of space. If this body has greater gravity pull than Earth, it will start tugging at us. Human beings will be snatched from the Earth as by a tornado and will shoot faster and faster out into space. Kent's illustration, which shows the inhabitants of a city flying into the vacuum of space, is made horrifying by its clever juxtaposition of incidental anecdote and sublime magnitude. The foreground figures appear to be lifted right off the city streets in their workaday clothes, a detail that captures the randomness with which degravitation might occur. Remember, Fisher said, at any moment. The instantaneousness of the cataclysm is countered, however, by its totality, made evident by the clusters of figures in the background. The souls float away in bunches. Now, in addition to Last Judgments, or Michelangelo's Last Judgment particularly, which also juxtaposes incidental detail with awesome scale, Kent likely drew some inspiration from depictions of apocalypse by the likes of Hieronymus Bosch, Albrecht Dürer, British artist John Martin, and the American artist Thomas Cole. Having said that, Kent's earlier work contained ample source material for his vision of the total end. He was no Leibnizian optimist. It was Gottfried Leibniz, remember, who claimed in 1710 that the universe that God chose to exist is the best of all possible universes. Voltaire, who countered that the world contains an amount of suffering too great to justify such cheery confidence, lampooned Leibniz's logic in his satirical novella Candide, first published in 1759. The book's most memorable scene is set in Lisbon during the cataclysmic earthquake that had struck in 1755, 4 years before the book was published. In the scene, Candide, who lies buried beneath rubble, cries out to Professor Pangloss, his impossibly cheerful tutor. Instead of helping Candide, however, Pangloss tries to convince him that, quote, all of this is for the best. In 1928, Kent produced engravings for an edition of Candide. It was, by the way, the very first book that Random House published. And this title page, as seen here, represents the destruction wrought by the Lisbon quake and ensuing tsunami. Smoke and flames from the conflagration enshroud the victims in ruined city. The discreet and ironic text banner placed in the clouds in the upper left reads, La raison suffisante, Leibniz's dictum of sufficient reason, that everything happens for a good reason. This most certainly did not impress Kent, a radical leftist. Kent was a member of many leftist organizations, including the John Reed Club, and eventually became a card-carrying communist. And he once joked that when the United States government issued a list of subversive organizations, he was ashamed because he only belonged to 85 of them. He produced his most stridently political print, Workers of the World Unite, the same year as the End of the World lithographs appeared in Life magazine. This print, made for the cover of the July 20th, 1937 issue of New Masses, a prominent left-wing publication, features a young, muscular proletariat confronting unseen adversaries, swinging a shovel against their raised bayonets as fires of revolution burn in the background. By 1937, Kent believed revolution to be the necessary and inevitable answer to capitalism, which he viewed as nothing more than cronyism. The obituary of today in America has surely now been written in the poor workshop of some struggling unknown man, Kent wrote as early as 1920. 16 years later, in a 1936 pamphlet titled, What is an American? He stated flatly, for me, the only way is communism. Coincidentally, the very same day the Life magazine article was published, the Washington Daily News printed an interview with Kent, who confirmed that his art was becoming, quote, more and more propaganda for the revolution. Kent's revolutionary apocalyptic rhetoric was even more pronounced in his opposition to fascism, or became more pronounced in his opposition to fascism. In May 1936, he exclaimed, "There are millions of people who think that being slaughtered is life, and that slaughtering or being slaughtered is its heaven-sent reward. So hurrah for fascism, and to hell with the human race." Fascism as a principle of government, he said, is absolutely and forever inconsistent with civilization. In an issue of the New Masses published 1 month after the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War, a dozen writers and artists, including Stuart Davis, Hugo Geller, and Max Weber, published statements decrying Franco. Referring again and again to doom and extinction, the testimonies describe an impending apocalypse. And Kent contributed a statement predicting, quote, that the civil butchery in Spain is the opening engagement of total world massacre. Now, of course, the apocalyptic tone was apparent in artworks as well. Picasso's Guernica, for instance, memorialized the victims of an April 1937 massacre in his native Spain, and Philip Guston's Bombardment also depicts the aerial bombardment of Spanish civilians. While both paintings reference specific atrocities, their surrealism transcends historical incident and signifies apocalypse at the cosmic scale, decrying destruction wherever and whenever it occurs. Like the surrealists, Kent viewed fascism as a destroyer of body, spirit, and the laws of nature. And Solar Flare-Up also employs surrealist aesthetics. Compare it, for instance, to Salvador Dali's famous soft construction with boiled beans, Premonition of Civil War, made in 1936. To invoke the apocalyptic horror of the impending Spanish Civil War, Dali paints a grotesque body set against a technicolor sky in a parched desert, ripping itself apart in what he called a delirium of auto-strangulation. In Solar Flare-Up, Kent conjures a similar surrealism by juxtaposing, as Dali does, the specific psychic and physical effects of a known and proximate calamity with an alien setting and incoherent scale. I've meant to show today how a diverse set of images circulated in the popular media to structure a feeling of dread in the United States in 1936 and 1937. Though I think that historical moment is relevant to our own moment, I do not, I'm sorry to report, have a final lesson to impart. And one reason for that is that while Rothstein's photograph and Kent's prints worked in similar ways, and at the same time to affect similar dreadful feelings, Rothstein and Kent were very different artists with very different attitudes about the catastrophes that they visualized. Rothstein, a New Deal employee, was a staunch advocate of federal intervention to alleviate ecological and social collapse. He was, in essence, an optimist who believed that liberal reform could prevent the end of the world. But Kent was a revolutionary, not a reformer. He believed, like other Marxists of his era, in wiping the slate clean and starting anew. Notice that the figures in Solar Flare-Up appear completely unperturbed by their impending doom, and instead place their possessions in a pile and await the end. They do not anticipate salvation. The lithographs in the End of the World series don't narrate a story about a purifying mortification that washes clean our sins and gives us a fresh start. Rather, they are manifestations of what Kent's contemporary, the poet Robertson Jeffers, called inhumanism. Jeffers called on humans to uncenter themselves and accept a shifting of emphasis and significance from man to not man. And that, as Kent might have said, is the end of the story. Thank you. Happy to field questions if there's time.
Thank you so much for that. Really is an almost impossibly appropriate subject for this day of all days, and it's really interesting body of work. I'm going to be fascinated to see how you take the project and to what degree it becomes a sort of overview, as you've suggested, or if you're going to restrict it to specific periods of time. Certainly, as you pointed out, in the contemporary art world, it is more and more a running thematic, it seems, inevitably. But let me see if there are questions. There may not be, actually.
That's okay if there aren't. I hope I didn't ruin everyone's afternoon.
Well, as you, I think, said to me originally when we first talked about you giving this lecture, it is a little awkward, isn't it, that it is sort of insistently dreadful. I mean, talking about it's an uncomfortable thing for most people to dwell so heavily on our destruction. And especially not, in a literal sense, as opposed to a science fiction sense, a fictive version with a nice redeeming moral, as you were implying at the end. And, I wondered if you could expound a little bit on that, because it is sort of strange the way that the Kent images in particular affect you. I've been trying to get my head around Rockwell Kent generally, because we were gifted that glorious painting that I
Right.
spoke to you about, which is actually now on view. It's a new acquisition through gift, and it's relentlessly bleak in some ways.
It is, right. I mean, Kent, you look at Kent's work, and especially the Greenland paintings, and but some earlier ones too, from Tierra del Fuego from the 1920s. There's a lot of barren landscape, dead trees, empty space, and also a lot of what I describe, metaphorically, really, as endings. That is, there aren't, like in conventional landscape painting, there's no neat path for the eye to sort of escape. There's lots of glaciers and very sort of austere mountains that really sort of obstruct our view and stop our literal and visual movement through space. And I think, I'm still trying to get my head around Kent's obviously very sort of visceral attraction to barrenness, and frankly, to death and to tragedy, and whether or not there's an optimism or a pessimism in his work and in his writing about this. Obviously, I don't know and never will know necessarily, Kent's mind. But I think, what I have found in looking at this body of work is that there are two ways of thinking about disaster and catastrophe today. And of course, one is about intervention and alleviation, remediation, or whatever one wants to call it. And certainly I feel that way on most days. There are things we can do. And I hope that we do. And I hope that I can play my small part. And there are times, I'll be honest, that I think others, and myself included, need to sort of come, to a kind of peace with the fact that that perhaps we are, I don't know if we're coming to the end of the world, but we're coming to the end of certainly sort of certain national identities and certain understandings of nature, and how it serves us versus how we serve it. And to be okay with those endings, in as much as that's possible. I don't know what that entails. Is that theology, spirituality, research, art, right? Obviously, for me, art is a place where we can feel some of these things because we don't know them yet. We don't know how to think about them. That's the overarching, message that I had for today. But you're right. I don't know actually how this project will be structured in terms of chapters. I see this material as a chapter, but it's large, in a book that takes on an investigation of American art and catastrophe in a series of chapters, 12 or 13, that are more or less chronological. This would be sort of in the middle of that.
And do you envision it in terms of an exhibition or in terms of a book alone?
So yeah, that is just right now in my career where I am as an art historian. That is really a personal question. I don't mean it's a personal question I'm not going to answer. I mean that the decision is being driven by personal factors in some ways right now. They are, I enjoy writing books, and I enjoy, frankly, the sort of solitude of that. And of course, once the book is complete it becomes public and you are laid bare, so to speak. And the kind of effort and work put into large collaborative exhibitions, I don't need to tell you, is enormous. And how to be a professor and currently chair of my department and a father, and to do that meaningfully that's what I mean by it's a personal matter. Yeah, and I think, I mean, that's true obviously of everybody, no matter what their endeavor.
No, I totally understand that.
This is a big project, and what I love about, and I'm so grateful for the opportunity to speak about it today, is that I haven't frequently spoken about projects at their very beginning.
Yeah.
And it's great because right now I don't feel the pressure to know exactly what shape it will take. Initially, I think I can write this up. I mean, I will be writing this up into an essay and seeing what it looks like and where it goes. And I really am grateful for an opportunity to sort of speak it, for the first time and see how it lands.
Well, we really adore when that happens. Coincidentally, it occasionally has happened that we've invited people to speak and caught them at the very beginning of their thought process. And it actually is quite exciting, not only for us as an audience, but I think for the scholar, because you naturally do have a passion and a curiosity that'll take you to places that you don't even really know you're going to go. And
right. As an academic, people often say, well, you must know what you think.
Right.
Yeah, I have a swarm of images and ideas, and so I'm feeling them and just starting to think them, and that's nice.
Well, the other thing that occurred to me, especially in thinking again about Kent, and I have thought more about Kent than I have Rothstein, that's for sure, is, you mentioned, I think, the sublime a couple of times, and, there are so many different varieties of the sublime, starting with Edmund Burke, but then going forward, and then in the 20th century idiom of, the sublime and color field painting, and that version of sublimity. And, Kent seems to occupy a really ambivalent position in that aesthetical register, right? In that, as you say, it's kind of difficult to say whether or not these are supposed to be inspirational images of nature or not, because they do have a sort of clear resonance, almost a sort of anticipation of the loss of nature through human corruption and intervention, and this idealization of a more primitive, quote unquote, version of a relationship with the land and with the sea. So it's all very backwards looking and nostalgic almost. He's recording a type of living and livelihood that would soon be completely stamped out. I mean, if we go back and look at the Inuits that he actually lived with, and where are they today, and how do they even feel? We talked about this, about the kinds of things that Kent recorded. So it's an interesting thing to try and figure out, as you say, within the intentional framework of Kent, what he's really hoping, to achieve. Because on the other hand, in terms of overall modernist aesthetic, his paintings are often classified as being, sort of classically modern in their graphical flatness,
absolutely,
peculiar, use or denial of gesture, that he kind of finds himself in that pantheon of artists who are high modernists.
Sure. I mean, you can put some of his 20s paintings against the Georgia O'Keeffe, and you're looking at what is easy to see as a similar sensibility, right? And you're so right about the sublime with Kent. I mean, on the one hand, he is after, and said as much, this sort of Kantian sublime of, I need to take myself to the limits of my knowledge so that I can feel deeply. And so, but that's also terrifying, right? So you have the sort of the rush of extending oneself beyond what you know, and then the terror. And then mixed with that, though, as you point out, are these very particular political and geographical issues that Kent cared about. And it is a heady amalgam of, specificity and particularity of place and sort of generality of, philosophy and of that, as you say, that sort of that modernism, mixed with frankly, somewhat old-fashioned and not unusual 1920s and 30s white masculinity that we
Right.
see, and so there is a lot to unpack, and there's, I think, still really important work to be done on Rockwell Kent.
I completely agree with you. I actually find Kent to be a much more complicated figure in the history of art, and especially in terms of American studies, than perhaps people have given him credit for. And the other thing that occurs to me, just sort of free associating right now with you, which, forgive me, it is sort of fun to do that with people who are as learned as you. It is just the death impulse and thanatos, because that does also seem to define his generation in terms of literature as well. And the white male aesthetic here that we're talking about is perhaps misunderstood frequently, because it's really not so much a celebration of the heroic ability of man to do what he wants and get what he wants. It's rather sort of the opposite. And the most manly thing it seems that you can do, according to this ideal, is confront your end with total and utter frankness and no idealization whatsoever. So, and the only way you can really do that is to thrust yourself into a situation where a natural disaster or nature itself is going to destroy you. But that, as you say, is a metaphor for where necessarily we might have to concede that we've arrived. And, maybe that is the only way you can get to the next, whatever it is, to a solution. So
it's an excellent point, and I agree absolutely. And that's why the sort of personal relevance for me of this is I'm not a pundit on climate change and on issues of natural and ecological and social disaster. I think about these things and I don't know. And so that's where art, and I don't think I'm alone in this, or that this is an original claim, right? But that's why I am drawn to art. That is why I'm an art historian, is that art lets us live and feel the paradoxes and the contradictions, in a way that is hopefully, as John Dewey might put it, right, instrumental, and we can bring it back to our social life. And so and Kent is right in the middle there. Obviously Rothstein's, I think, position, such as it was much, I don't want to say simpler, I don't mean to sound condescending. I mean, he had a very accessible or a kind of philosophy, if you will, that was very much in keeping with the New Deal progressives. And he said as much, and even later in his life in the 60s and 70s when he gave interviews, said as much. And, I think that's something that we have easier access to. I don't pretend to have total access to Rothstein's thinking, but, his attitude was, let's show these things and share them so that we can fix them.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, the other thing that you bring up, and it's such a useful thing to look at images in this way, and it's sort of the magic of the digital age, where you can break down these kind of hierarchies between different types of imagery, and in dealing with larger visual culture as a whole, and then the intermixing of these kinds of images in something like Life magazine, for example, is a wonderful demonstration of that. And I was just thinking to myself, being a bit of a science fiction hound, in my younger days, Frank Herbert's series is now finally being imaged in its most sophisticated form through the long-awaited release of the movie, I guess, and the series through HBO. But it is incredibly appropriate in a way that there should be suddenly a resurgence of interest in that series, because that's pretty much the same thing. That's what it's about. It's about a sort of parallel universe that slowly and utterly is destroying itself through the exploitation of natural resources for awfully selfish and political ends, right?
For sure. And my first research stop which I wasn't able to do because of the pandemic, was going to be the Hayden Archives. And I just was so fascinated by the Hayden Planetarium shows and the complexity and the production, the sort of level of expense and production put into these shows that were at the sort of intersection of science fiction and real world fears. And so unfortunately I wasn't able to, and that is, still on my first sort of priority, is to sort of begin there. And I think that notion about science fiction is a really, really critical one to this broader discussion. Thanks for pointing that out.
Well, that and unfortunately gaming culture, which I'm going to have to say is also squarely a part of this incredible mix. Because as much as people can decry the violence that it seems to enact on a fantastic scale, it also is this weird attempt to find some kind of pleasure in being able to conquer the unconquerable in a doom scenario that you actually can escape. And, I do think that's actually significant that in itself is a narrative setup that so many people find actually appealing. I mean, think about it. I mean, why would you want to put yourself in the middle of an apocalypse and constantly have to, kill 10,000 zombies to get out of it? It's a really odd,
it is. Well, yeah, and it's also, finding entertainment in dystopia, right? I mean, but you're right that it's easy to critique from that kind of that parental point of view of this is no good for you, but it is also, as you suggested, a fascinating kind of coping mechanism, or maybe even a way of inhabiting things in worlds that we know are perhaps impending and aren't ready to face in reality. So it's lots of good stuff there. Yeah, I mean, this obviously, any project on art and disaster is potentially limitless. And my big challenge will be, determining what kind of shape I want to give this larger project.
Well, I'm going to ask you one last question because
Sure.
I just got one, and then I'm going to let you go because I know we've taken a lot of your time already. This is from Joan Davidson, and she asked, what inspired you to cover this subject? She says, I was married to a man who lived in Kansas through the Dust Bowl and Depression, and it informed his life in very real ways. I happened to be reading Kristen Hanna, The Four Winds, also about this time. She says it's riveting.
So, the reason that I ended up focusing on the Dust Bowl in the 1930s as the sort of point of entry for this broader project on American art and catastrophe. I mean, there are a number of answers to the question. I appreciate the question. Thank you. One is just pragmatic or practical, I suppose. It is an area of expertise for me. I mean, I have written about Thomas Hart Benton in the 1930s, and I have a kind of familiarity with the history of the era and the region that gives me a degree of confidence that's necessary whenever you're starting a project. So that's sort of the practical reason. The other is because of my understanding of the seriousness of our current ecological crisis and the way that the Dust Bowl offers lessons for us today. And then the third reason is, Rothstein's photograph has always been very affecting to me. And not just this one, but others of his, in particular, the one that I showed, pardon me, here. And I have found myself sometimes with these FSA photographs, not all of them, but most of them, as finding them quite difficult to read. I don't know always what to do with them. Dorothea Lange's Migrant Mother, there's a photograph that I can read for my students and for myself, I think, with some sophistication and depth. But there's a certain kind of flatness to these photographs. And I think it's because they continue to be reproduced so commonly without deep reading and deep analysis. They have become really just placeholders for the Dust Bowl. And the photographs themselves are just have sort of been deactivated and sort of left desiccated and unread. There's plenty of history on FSA photography. I mean, more than plenty. But read those histories and you'll find that the photographs themselves are not frequently read, right? And I think in part it's because they're hard to read, and there's a lot of reasons for that. And so I found this a combination of a challenge for me personally and intellectually. This is an era I'm familiar with. I knew about Kent's work, and I wanted to see if I could bring these images back to life. Not to celebrate them necessarily, or to return them to some level of iconic status. That's not my desire, but just to see what life there is in them today. And I continue to find it difficult. It's and so there are a number of reasons that I was attracted to this particular subject as my point of entry for this project. I hope that answers your question somewhat. I'm obviously happy to answer anyone's questions if you have any by shoot me an email. You can find me at UMaine website quite easily, and very happy to share my thoughts about this if people have more questions.
Well, that's incredibly generous of you, and I want to thank you again for taking the time to do this lecture for us. We feel very fortunate to be part of your thought process. It's obviously going to be a fascinating project, and I do hope to see it in either book form or exhibition form or both at some point in the very near future. But in the meantime, I hope we can welcome you back another time to lecture for us. We really deeply appreciate it. Thank you so much for doing this, and thank you to all of you for attending.
And thank you so much for attending, and thank you for hosting me. I'm very grateful. And I neglected to say that you have in the Santa Barbara Museum of Art the Rothstein photograph, and obviously the Rockwell Kent painting. And I should have pointed that out earlier on, but I would love to visit when travel is easier and see that Kent painting. Thanks so much for having me, everybody.
I hope you keep that promise, and just a reminder to everyone who is out there and maybe local to us that the museum is now open. The grand reopening has happened, and we're very glad to have so many of our galleries up and running and fully installed. So do come and visit us. Just visit our website to see what our COVID protocols are. As always, with that disastrous bit of news, I'll bid you farewell. Bye.
Be well, be safe.
You too.